Hello and welcome back to this Download Idealistic Crusade. This video will be a review of the Warner Archive Blu-ray release of the second film based off of Batman the Animated Series. This one released as a direct-to-video, that is Batman and Mr. Freeze Subzero. This was released in 1997. It was packaged to tie in with the release of Batman and Robin, and ironically definitely has the greater fan and critical reception compared to that film's rather infamous release and the backlash that pretty much immediately happened. This is also really sort of the last hurrah of the original animated series in terms of the original cast, crew, design, and animation style, because after this, they were already working on Superman the Animated Series. They had done essentially the 3 seasons of Batman the Animated Series, and they would come back later and do a 4th season called The New Batman Adventures, and that featured the new redesign and everything. So by the time this film, Subzero, came out as a direct-to-video release on tape and Laserdisc, it is really sort of the last animated series story in the original production timeline, because again, after this they did the redesign and New Batman Adventures, although it usually gets called a 4th season. It's really more of its own thing. It's tonally a bit different. It had some crew shakeups. Some people left and went on to other things. Some new people came in, and it's got a different sort of feeling to it, even though it usually gets again grouped in with the first 3 seasons. So Subzero is important in that way, but in terms of comparing it to the other theatrical feature, which is Mask of the Phantasm, which did get a theatrical release, while that film is a beautiful film in its own right and really a masterpiece, Subzero very much feels much more like a couple episodes strung together. It's not bad, mind you, but it's not as much of a standalone as Mask of the Phantasm is. And you can pretty much look at the first, second, and third acts as if it were 3 animated series episodes strung together. And since it runs 67 minutes, that's basically 3 21-minute episodes strung together, and then it's got credits at the end. So the story is fine, but it doesn't really do much more than what they were already doing with 2-parters. They didn't really do 3-parters, but I think you can really look at this film as very much like a 2 or 3-parter episode, kind of just connected together. The other interesting thing to note is there are a number of CGI shots scattered throughout the film, most notably the opening sequence, but then some of the action sequences mix in CGI footage into the traditional animated style. So it is very jarring when you see it for the first time. I remember even when I watched this as a kid over and over, those scenes really stuck out, and they have not aged as well, shall we say, as the rest of the animation. But I will give them credit. This was still relatively early on in CGI usage, especially in children's animation, and it definitely it's much better than it could have been. And when you look at it, it obviously is a bit ropey here and there, and you can tell that it doesn't hold up to the traditional animated footage and the rest of the sequences, but it is integrated pretty well, and it's not just thrown in there to be just a big CGI showstopper and it stops the movie. But that is something important to note. They were already working with that stuff because digital animation was becoming more and more affordable and would eventually take over everything. So this is, again, really sort of the last traditional animated series story done with their animated style, with most of the original cast and crew still on board, and really at the tail end of the original 3-season run of the show. Now, when Warner Archive did their Blu-ray, this was to follow up their Mask of the Phantasm Blu-ray, so we got matching original artwork carrying over to a nice Blu-ray case with a modern DC logo. In terms of the color, this is a bit darker and a bit more saturated than the older releases if you look at the actual art. And the actual disc uses that, so that looks quite nice. Now, like most Warner Archive discs, this will replicate any older features, but is otherwise bare bones. So what they did here is they actually included the primary Mr. Freeze appearances in Batman the Animated Series. So those episodes are included. This film really marked the sort of finale for Mr. Freeze in the animated series, but they kind of undid that when they brought him back for New Batman Adventures and then Batman Beyond. So I really I don't really like what they did with him after this point, but this was definitely sort of like his character exit point. It closed off his arc that started with Heart of Ice. But all of the Mr. Freeze episodes, including the new Batman Adventures 1 and the Batman Beyond 1, are included. They are all standard def, so they are pretty much, just exactly what you got on the DVD releases of these shows. But those are nicely included, so you can watch the entire Mr. Freeze arc if you want to, all in one place with, Subzero, the feature, slotted in the middle. Then they include the two little bits that were added for the DVD, so the little music montage and then the how to draw Batman little thing. Those are really sort of throwaways. And then it does include the little trailer that was made, so that was nice. In terms of the audio, it is, Dolby Stereo encoded, Matrix Stereo. It is losslessly encoded, and it sounds great. And like Mask of the Phantasm, it's pretty much a bigger, more boisterous version of the audio with beautiful scoring that we got from the animated series. But it's not quite as nuanced as Mask of the Phantasm, because this was a straight-to-video. It was not getting a theatrical release. It is said, looking at an old interview that Boyd Kirkland, the director, gave, that he was talking about the mixing process, and he said in that interview that they did a 5.1 mix. So that's caused some discussion online, and Warner Archive did do some digging. They said all they found was the Matrix Stereo track that we've always had, and that there's no evidence a 5.1 mix was done. It's still unsure if there is perhaps a 5.1 mix, or maybe Kirkland was referring to being on the mixing stage and talking about, the 4-track master before it was folded back down to stereo. So this still sounds great. They could have upped it to a 5.1 up mix, but there's really no point, because this already sounds great. And, when you decode it back out, it's basically a much more robust audio track than compared to, say, an episode from season 2 or season 3 of the show. So there's no issues there. And then to talk about the older releases very quickly, this is where we get more discussion that caused some back and forth online. And this is one place where I do feel the archive could have done something better. So, of course, I've got the original VHS clamshell release behind me. This is how we all saw it back in the day. This is in the 4:3 ratio, as is the Warner Archive disc, and all the times you see it on television airings. This is how the film was animated. And this, of course, has Matrix Stereo as well, but on the VHS hi-fi tracks. Seeing this type of clamshell makes me feel really, really old. But then we come to the Laserdisc, which is a very late release. So this is a very uncommon title. It's a very rare disc to find. This was actually pressed by Image. That's how late it was. Warner and most studios handed off their releases on Laserdisc to Image because they were already focused on the DVD releases. So this did, quickly get a DVD release and a snapper case and then a keep case. I used to have the DVD, but I don't have it anymore, unfortunately. But it is, the same exact master. But it is 4:3, like all the other releases. Whereas the Laserdisc, as you can see here on this little crediting info, it's talking about the original 1:6:6:1 aspect ratio, and that this is a letterbox transfer. So, like Mask of the Phantasm, and you can see storyboards, glimpsed in some of the little brief extras. Storyboards where they are protecting for a widescreen framing inside the 4:3 original board. So it was apparently, the director's wish to have a matted widescreen presentation, and because it's 1:6:6, you don't have the same issues with the 1:8:5 on Mask of the Phantasm, where some things feel too tight. And this was also done in the actual process, so it wasn't something done after the fact like they had to do on Phantasm. So the 1:6:6 ratio is an original ratio, and unfortunately that has never been replicated. So the Warner Archive Blu-ray is just the standard 1:3:3 or 4:3 presentation. So of course that means you are losing information essentially on the top and the bottom to get that sort of widescreen effect. But when you look at the Laserdisc and you actually watch it, the presentation is very nice. It never feels cramped like Mask of the Phantasm does on widescreen. There is a greater sense of grandeur with a more traditional cinematic seeming image, but again, you are losing significant portions of the top and the bottom of the frame because it's just simply being matted off. unfortunately, it's not replicated on the Blu-ray, so I think that is an oversight. I know Warner Archive did apparently consider it, and they did do their due diligence in researching the title and presenting it beautifully, but I do wish they had included the 166 as an alternate presentation, because I know some people really like that look, and unfortunately it is confined to the Laserdisc, so that is still the only way you can see the alternative director's widescreen presentation version. And it was done in the original animating process. It was designed to be protected for widescreen. So this sort of transition period was something that all the DC animated titles went back and forth on. Their Justice League series kind of went back and forth on this, and then the Teen Titans series has been presented both ways on streaming and home video and television broadcasts. And then once they went exclusively widescreen, that's how it stayed. And this was all before the HD TV transition in the early to mid 2000s, when everything went 16:9, 1.78 to 1. So there is a little bit of back and forth on these titles, but I do think it would have been a great thing, and would have helped make this release truly definitive had the archive included a 1.66 matted widescreen presentation. So that for me is the real drawback to this release, because other than that, it's another perfect example of the Warner Archive knocking it out of the park and actually taking the time to research the possibility of there being a 5.1 mix and including the Mr. Freeze episodes, even though they are standard def. So this is still a great presentation, don't get me wrong, but if you can find it, because it is quite rare and expensive, I think all fans should have a copy of the Laserdisc to have the alternative ratio presentation. And of course, it looks great on an LD jacket, and it's a nice bragging piece because it is a pretty late release and does not pop up very often. I myself didn't put too much stock into it until I finally located a copy and watched it, and was struck at how well the framing worked. And then I dug through the extras more, and I found those storyboards where it clearly shows the 4x3 storyboard frame, but then they've got the matted widescreen drawn in there to protect the widescreen ratio framing. So it was planned out for each shot. So it's not just something they slapped on at the end of the day and said, oh, we want to make this look cinematic. So that for me is the one real drawback. And again, it is still possible there is a 5.1 mix floating around, but the archive division did not find anything in the Warner vaults. So I'm thinking it probably does not exist, but you never know. It could be somewhere, and it was just not turned up when the archive went looking for it in the Warner Brothers vaults. But outside of that, this is another essential Warner Archive release, and it is replicated in the complete series, I should say the complete animated series box set. It is the same disc in the US set, so you don't have to have the standalone, but again, like all Batman fans, we all went out and bought the two Warner Archive feature releases, and because we did, that convinced the studio to release the complete series Blu-ray. So I've held on to this because, again, it's cool having it as a standalone Blu-ray, and as you can see, I still have my older copies, and I'll be hanging on to my Laserdisc, and I've still got my VHS tape because nostalgia demands so, and it's a cool-looking tape anyway, so I'll be hanging on to this, and of course the spine looks really nice in the traditional Warner Archive style. So that's it for the review of the Warner Archive Blu-ray release, Batman and Mr. Freeze Subzero, the second and final feature released off of Batman the Animated Series, and really sort of the final iteration of the classic animated series style, because after this we would get the sort of relaunch with the slightly different in tone, the new Batman adventures. So still an essential release, but again, since we're all looking at the complete series box set and the discs are replicated in there, you really don't have to have the standalone versions, but if you've got them already, if you're like me, you can't bear to part with them. I just wish that it had the widescreen presentation that's on the Laserdisc. I wish it was like their Mask of the Phantasm, where they included both ratios, but it's not a deal breaker. It's still an essential, beautiful disc, but I just wish it had that as an alternative, because it is a cool presentation, and it does add more of that cinematic feel if you like that sort of thing. So as always, please leave any comments you have below, and keep physical media alive, keep your disc spinning. Thanks ever so much for watching.